All right. Lauren, would you advance to the next slide, please? All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank you for joining us on our webinar for applying to hazard mitigation assistance grants. My name is Mark Thompson. I'm the State Hazard Mitigation Officer at the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. I really do appreciate you being here today. As I mentioned, we are recording the webinar and we'll post it along with the slides to our website this week. Go to the next slide, please, Lauren. Thank you. So some of you might be here specifically thinking it's for BRIC or flood mitigation assistance, but we as an agency are still prioritizing the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP, but really the application process for any of the three is the same. If you've read our HMGP announcements over the last year, they've pretty consistently said that we're going to score, rank, and prioritize projects based on the Colorado Resiliency Office's framework, as well as either FEMA's BRIC or FMA criteria. So we do need to address those today just to give you the full perspective of what we'll be looking for in applications. We are also in the process of finalizing some sub-application templates along with Haggerty, our consultant, for some of our more common project types that will help you as a community successfully apply. But more importantly, we hope that this webinar, along with those templates and your interactions with our mitigation team, are going to help you implement meaningful, beneficial, and impactful projects on the ground to reduce your risk from natural hazards. Because that's really what we're here to do. Is we're not here to apply for grants. We're not here to process grants. We're here to do meaningful work that reduces risk and hopefully maybe prevents a future disaster from actually being a disaster and just being a bad day instead of a worse day. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lauren Dozier from Haggerty Consulting and let her take the lead on the rest of this webinar. Depending on your questions, either she or a member of the Haggerty team will answer them, or if there's something unique to the state, then we'll step in and answer those. So Lauren, please take it away.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, we also have the chat function or the messaging function that is available if you have just a kind of quick question. And we also will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. All right, so getting into the overview of the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grant, what that comprises of is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program, and the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. They're all a little bit different in their uniqueness, but they also all have a lot of the same commonalities, especially in regards to how you compile a sub-application. So today, we're going to go over all three of these programs, more focusing on HMGP, as Mark said, in order to kind of give the sub-applicants a better idea of some of the best practices for compiling a sub-application. For HMGP, this is the FEMA-funded, state-administered program. It is directly tied to a disaster declaration. Therefore, we refer to it as a post-disaster in non-COVID related times, 2021 disasters. It typically has a 25% cost share. The 2020-21 disasters have a 10% cost share. You'll see the funding amounts there, $78.5 million and $71.7 million for funding amounts for 2021 and 2022. BRIC is a FEMA-funded, state-administered program. It's not directly tied to a disaster declaration, meaning it's an annual grant. It's a high-impact neighborhood-scale project looking for innovative solutions. on an annual basis. It is a local cost share of 25% or 10% for qualified economically disadvantaged rural communities. Last year's funding for BRIC was right at $1 billion. This year, we've seen a significant increase in that to $2.3 billion. Lastly, we do have the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant. Again, FEMA funded and state administered. And it is an annual program, meaning it's not tied to a disaster declaration, with the overall goal of reducing national flood insurance payments to the NFIP. Depending on the type of project, as well as the location of the project, you will have a 0, 10%, or 25% cost share for this program. Again, the difference between 2021 and 2022 funding is quite significant. 2021 it was $160 million, and then this year we're looking at $800 million. So we're definitely seeing an increase in the amount of funding that FEMA is allowing for mitigation type projects. And looking at the HMGP funding state deadlines for the upcoming HMGP cycles, what the state is looking at, and Matt will talk a little bit more about this later on, but November is when they're really going for having completed HMGP applications for the 10% federal cost share. And then February 2023 is for the sub-applications that will be applying for those projects that are going to be the 25% non-federal cost share. So those, they could be extended with FEMA approval, but those are the dates that the state is aligning itself with right now. So for BRIC and FMA key dates, we have a little bit different of a timeline with those. September 30th, 2022, FEMA Go opened for sub-application development, meaning it was now possible to start sub-applications in FEMA Go. Today, of course, we're having our first webinar regarding these programs specifically on best practices. November 4th is the target date for the draft sub-applications due to the state, with a December 9th date for those final applications. DHSEM scoring panels will reside in January the 9th through the 13th, and then they'll be submitting those to FEMA through FEMA Go, January 27th, 2023. Just as a note, all BRIC and FMA draft sub-applications must be completed in the FEMA Go portal rather than the eGrants portal for HMGP. So some of the common similarities between the FEMA HMA grant programs, there's a number of things that they all share. A couple of those being here, they have to be an eligible sub-applicant, meaning local government, state agencies, cities, townships, counties, special districts, tribal governments. For certain nonprofits, for HMGP, those may be eligible. Businesses and individuals are not eligible. Any specific property owner would have to go through their local government in order to apply. You have to have a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan. And those are those local hazard mitigation plans that each community puts together in order to evaluate, number one, their risks and their plans to address all of those natural hazard risks for the next 5 years. No construction or groundbreaking activities before grant award. The NOI must be approved by the state before moving into a sub-application. All of these programs must, all the projects that are submitted must have a scope of work with a clear level of protection increase. So we must show that the mitigation project is going to be effective in reducing risk. All of these programs, you have to have a benefit cost analysis with a benefit cost ratio greater than 1. So this applies to all of your construction projects, you know, including wildfire. There are local match requirements, as we've already discussed, associated with all of these projects. Period performance by statute, they are 36 months. However, we can start to talk about longer period of performances with BRIC and FMA. All of these mitigation projects submitted for these programs, they must constitute an independent mitigation solution, meaning we have to have the evidence that producing this project or completing this project isn't contingent upon another mitigation action in order to be effective. It also has to be compliant with federal regulations, including 2 CFR 200 and environmental and historic preservation laws. And then, of course, all the sub-applications must address the Colorado Resiliency Framework criteria that Mark discussed earlier. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt to talk about the actual process of submitting a notice of interest.
All right. Hey, thanks, Lauren. Hey, my name is Matt Arsenault. I work with the state with Mark Thompson and our mitigation team. So the first step for submitting is submitting a notice of interest. And we've created a simple Google sheet. This is the link is going to be here, and it'll be in the slides once they're posted on the our website. It kind of just, when you submit this and fill out this simple form and hit submit, it goes to the entire mitigation team, so we all get visibility on it. So think of this notice of interest as a project proposal. I mean, you're coming to us with a project proposal, seeing if it's eligible or seeing if it's cost effective. We get that idea up front. So once we review this notice of interest as a team or as a section, we will review it for eligibility as an eligible mitigation project, and also as an eligible jurisdiction. We will look it over. We will either approve it or reject it. Regardless, we're going to be in contact with you to either say, I'm sorry, this project is ineligible, or you as a jurisdiction is not an eligible jurisdiction. And if it's deemed like a potentially eligible project under one of our 3 HMA programs, then we will reach out for what we call a project scoping call, is where we could kind of outline our review process, which is outlined on this picture or display on the right-hand side, and then give you as the sub-applicant a chance to kind of, in your own words, explain what type of mitigation project you are applying for. You know, and speaking on that, we do accept these notice of interest all throughout the year. So that way, when deadlines or when these grant programs have application deadlines, we could work with you guys throughout the year to further define the scope, the cost effectiveness, the schedule, all the things to make you a strong competitor for these FEMA mitigation funding. Next slide, Lauren. So after we've done the NOI review, we've completed a project scoping call with you. We're going to refer you to our state-run grants management platform. We use this as grants management for projects or federal awards that have already been awarded, but we also use it to further develop a full application, which we will submit to FEMA at a later date when it is completed. It's called CO Colorado EM Grants. It is, like I said, a state-run platform. It's really just a conduit of between a sub-applicant and the state. FEMA does not have visibility on this system. So it's just a way to upload documents, send it to us for review, and we can send it back for revisions. And if you are a new user, we do have to get you registered in the system. But again, that is after your NOI has been submitted and after we've had an initial call to see if it is completely an eligible activity for one of our programs. Next slide, Lauren. Yeah, so once registered, you have to navigate to whatever jurisdiction it be. In this example, it'd be the city or Denver County. And then once you're at that main homepage, you would click on create a new request. And then it drops down into apply for a grant. And then you would select this PDM, HMA pre or HMA pre-application review. And what we've done here is we've created kind of like a ghost grant where eligible jurisdictions can apply for a ghost grant in this program. And all it does is it's a place for us to house all the sub-applications that we receive. And then it's a way that we could send back to the sub-applicant for revisions. They can send it back to us. And once we submit it to FEMA and it gets awarded, then we could take it out of this ghost grant and move it to the active grant, for which it was funded under. And we do have resources on how to navigate our EM Grants platform. And those are available on the actual site, EM Grants, under resources and references. One thing to note is when a user goes into the system and they create an application or sub-application, I'm sorry, and they fill out all the particular sections, the budget, scope of work, history of hazards, cost, schedule, all that. Until it is submitted or advanced to DHSEM, it's going to stay in that individual's draft. So nobody else from the organization can see that until it is advanced to us. And then if we then return it back to the sub-applicant, then everybody that's within that jurisdiction can see that sub-application. So please take note of that. Also know there is an option in EM Grants that you could submit all your supporting documentation, which we'll discuss later on in this presentation. Supporting material, maps, required forms, letters of support, letters of match commitment, any environmental and historic preservation documents that you might have. This system works really well where you could upload all those documents in the system, and us as a state has visibility on it, and you as the local jurisdiction or special district do as well. Next, please, Lauren. Now, just to touch on this again, I know this is more of an HMGP focus, but I wanted to let everybody know that's on the webinar is that to apply for BRIC and FMA, there is a special federal system that you would use to submit or to fill out and submit sub-applications to DHSEM that is outside of the state-run platform that we use for HMGP, which is EM Grants. So if you are interested in submitting BRIC or FMA sub-applications, we are certainly here to assist you on that as well. That is just not the main focus of this webinar at this time. All right, next slide, Lauren. All right, starting on the left, application development and eventual submission. DHSEM and our Haggerty team that we brought on board, we're here to offer assistance in project scoping, reviewing draft scopes of work, schedule, budgets, any other supporting documentation you might have. We're also here to assist you in developing a benefit cost analysis to ensure that your project is cost effective. So staying on the left-hand side, so when you submit a sub-application in EM Grants to DHSEM, please note that it does not go to FEMA. That's a state-run system. So when you hit submit, it just goes to our mitigation staff where we review it. There is another platform that only state and federal users use to submit for HMGP. So that's why we use this ghost grant, so I could copy and paste stuff that you guys have in your sub-application into FEMA's portal, which you guys don't have access to. So just remember that just when if you hit submit, it doesn't mean it's just going to the state. Once it's submitted to us, we'll do a thorough review, and then we'll issue any RFIs or requests for information that we might have, like, hey, do you have a better map? Do you have a better floodplain map or documentation? Stuff like that. All right, moving to the right-hand side. Once we finalize the sub-application from you, we feel it's very strong, 100%. That is when our team will submit it under a different grant platform called NEMIS. FEMA Region 8 reviews it. If they have any questions, then they will issue an RFI to the state, and then the state will reach out to the local jurisdiction. Just remember, the state is the applicant, and you guys are the sub-applicants. For BRIC and FMA, same thing. We're the applicant. You guys are the sub-applicants. You would submit an application to us in FEMA Go. I would submit my application to FEMA in FEMA Go as a state. And that goes to the nationally competitive review panel for further review. Also of note on the bottom, we will convene a state agency scoring panel for BRIC and FMA if there are multiple applications, and we will also do the same if we have HMGP sub-applications that the demands are exceeding what we have available per HMGP disaster. Next slide. I believe that's my last one, I think.
Yep.
All right, thanks, Lauren.
All right, thank you, Matt. All right, going into the different types of sub-applications for these programs, FEMA has provided an array of sub-application types that are eligible under these programs. We have planning and planning-related activities. So these are related to and must tie back to the local hazard mitigation plan. So some of these activities include integrating from other mitigation plans with other planning efforts. And these can include, specific hazard risk assessments, stormwater plans, evaluating code and ordinances, and a BCA is not required for those. For the bulk of these types of projects that FEMA funds, we have our projects and our phase projects. So these are what we think of when we think of the standardized construction project. So these projects must reduce risk to people, structures, infrastructure from a natural hazard, and again must be tied back to an independent mitigation solution. Colorado's scoring criteria does emphasize projects that reduce and address high-risk areas, social equity, and have a generational impact. So those larger type of projects that provide solutions and provide high impacts to a community are generally those projects that are going to have the most pull and that are going to be looked by not only by Colorado but FEMA to be funded. Some example projects here for these are your wildfire mitigation type projects, so hazardous fuels reduction, defensible space. This also includes your typical like flood type projects, floodplain stream restoration, any localized flood risk reduction project, and those do require a benefit cost analysis. Advanced assistance or project scoping. So these are the types of projects that the sub-applicants may use to develop mitigation strategies and obtain data to prioritize, select, and develop HMGP BRIC or FMA applications in a timely manner. So these are going to be kind of a precursor to the projects and the phase projects, in that you may not know what the solution is or be able to identify alternatives. So this is the type of funding that would assist you in doing that and lead to a future sub-application. So feasibility studies, engineering design, environmental studies, developing data for benefit cost analysis, and those types of projects, BCA is not required. Lastly, these are 5% initiative projects. These fall under HMGP. these types of projects, they're difficult to evaluate using a traditional FEMA approved cost benefit, but otherwise meet HMGP requirements. So it's important to note this isn't a workaround for projects that have a benefit cost ratio less than 1, but rather it's an alternative method for those projects that may not necessarily fit into the project or project phased approach. So an example of this would be, a hazard warning system or something similar of that type that the cost benefit isn't as easy to determine. So going into BRIC also has what they call capability and capacity building activities. There is a state allocation of $2 million that is separate from the competitive funding. And this is the entire pot for $2 million for the state of Colorado. Eligible activities underneath the state allocation include project scoping, building code activities, partnership activities, and planning activities. When you're talking about project scoping activities, again, these are the activities that help build the pipeline of future shovel-ready mitigation projects. So again, these should be used when the problem and the solution are not known. The sub-applicant may need to more fully evaluate alternative solutions or potential intervention. Deliverables are very specific and they do need to be included for these types of activities. And that would be some kind of project design, benefit cost analysis, environmental and historical planning. FMA also has capability and capacity building under this funding source. It is $60 million, competitive nationwide. There is no state allocation for this. It just, it's going to be funding that you're going to have to apply for on a competitive rolling basis every year. For eligible activities and funding caps, these are all federal share, multi-hazard plans, $25,000 per local plan, with the note that Colorado is moving all hazard mitigation plan updates to HMGP or BRIC. For project scoping is $900,000 per sub-application, and additional CNCB activities is $300,000. For this particular category of funding, FEMA is going to be providing a 90% cost share for activities benefiting areas with a CDC SBI of greater than 0.5. Additional CNCB activities, that's something new this year that FEMA has included. This includes things like partnership development, any activities enhancing local floodplain management, SRL or repetitive loss strategies. And the biggest thing with FMA and the hardest objective to kind of fulfill here is that all sub-applications submitted under the CNC bucket must demonstrate that activities will reduce the flood claims against the National Flood Insurance Program. So in this particular area in general in Colorado, there's not a large NFIP covered, I want to say population or amount of structures, places where you would see more NFIP coverage. Also often include places obviously near the coast where they have a lot of floods on a more annual basis. But we did want to include this as one of the eligible activities for FMA. So going into like the meat of the sub-application and kind of going over our best practices. So your project title, it should be unique in that it identifies the name of the sub-applicant, so the city, county, etc. The location of the project site, gives you an indication of where the project is, and then the type of mitigation activity. So for example, here we've listed the city of Arvada, Clear Creek, stream restoration, and flood risk reduction. It should provide an example or a overall idea of what the project is doing by describing the mitigation type. In the title itself, we should avoid using FEMA, HMA, and eligible activity terms like repair, maintenance, maintained. We want to stay away from ineligible language because that's going to give FEMA the first indication when they're looking at your sub-application that, there could be something worth looking into here. So make sure your project title, you spend a little time thinking about it and how a short title can best represent your project. Like we said, it should be an introduction to where and what the project is. Talking about the scope of work, your scope of work is really going to be, a lot of the meat of what your sub-application should include. It should describe, we included all of these questions here, who is affected? Who's the population that is going to be protected? Who is going to be impacted most by this project? Who will perform the work? Is it going to be you as the sub-applicant? Or is it going to be a contractor that you've hired through a competitive procurement process to do the work? Where is the proposed project? Can you give any locations in your narrative, in your descriptions to give FEMA and the reviewer who aren't familiar with where your project is, exactly where it is in relationship to the natural hazard that you're facing and the population that it's impacting? Where is the project located? Again, just going back to, where is this located? How does it relate to the population at hand? What is the proposed project? What are you trying to accomplish? How are you going to do it? This is the biggest part and the things that we see most often when we're reviewing sub-applications. Be clear, be concise when you're describing this, and write it as you would describe it to somebody who doesn't know your project, because the reviewer, even at the state level or at the federal level, isn't as familiar with your project as you as the local jurisdiction are. So you want to address, all of these items within the narrative to give an idea for your reviewer of what exactly you're proposing. We want to specifically talk about as well, why is the project needed? What are the issues? How are the damages correlated to the project that you're proposing? And what keeps you up at night regarding this? This is an opportunity for you to tell FEMA and to tell the state, obviously, justify why this project deserves their funding or the federal funding. Some words that are great to use within your narratives include words like restoration, retrofit, hardening, resilience, relocation. Any references to maintenance, repair, replacement, old, broken down. We really want to stay away from that type of verbiage and those type of activities, as they are ineligible. So we want to ensure that we're keeping all aspects of our narrative, including eligible activities, within the scope of an eligible project. We want to ensure that we are telling the federal reviewer about our community in a way that they'll understand. So that's our scope of work. And really the scope of work, your schedule and your budget are the three items that should sustain each other. They should tie back to each other, and they should inform other aspects of your sub-application. Other sub-application work sections in the actual sub-application itself. How does the project align with the goals and the strategies identified in the local hazard mitigation plan? Does your local hazard mitigation plan really refer to and acknowledge that flooding is the most impactful hazard in your community? If so, how is this project that you are presenting relating back to that? So that always is something that kind of stumps folks. And just, if you think about it in the way that we've evaluated all of the natural hazard problems within the local hazard mitigation plan, how does that tie back to the project that you're proposing? So clearly describe the natural hazard problem that will be mitigated by the proposed project, and just ensure that the project will be appropriate to the hazard problem. On EM grants, it's kind of easy. There's a history of hazards page in which you can actually include all of that data within the sub-application. You also want to identify 2 other alternatives. Again, EM grants lays this out in alternatives analysis. One should always be a no action alternative. And what this means is what will be impacted if this project does not happen? How will this come to fruition? What will continue to happen? What are the damages that you will continue to experience? Lay out for the reviewer exactly the impacts that will happen if no other actions pertaining to this project are implemented. And then you also want to include one other feasible alternative. And these 2 items show FEMA that you've evaluated not only not doing this project, but another project in lieu of that. So this feasible alternative should be another route to accomplishing the same goal. But understanding that your proposed project is your preferred alternative. So just try to explain this to your viewer the best that you can, that you've explored other options. And after exploring the other options, your proposed project is the one that makes the most sense for your community. This slide goes into constitutes, what is a good scope of work versus a bad scope of work. We've gone through a lot of these already. I'm not going to read every one. But some of the things that we really want to hone in on, does the good scope of work, does it answer the 5 W's, and how does it do that? It's a statement that identifies the activity and what will be completed during the period of performance. Again, uses clear, concise, and descriptive terms. States the level of protection to be provided, as well as the increase in the level of protection. It identifies the hazard and the problem to be addressed, and it fully addresses environmental, historical impacts, and other logistical considerations. Obviously, what constitutes a bad scope of work? We see a lot of sub-applications that instead of including a strong narrative, they refer to other sections of the sub-application for content. That really takes away from the reviewer's understanding of your project. So include all the information that you can and refer back to other documentation as needed, understanding that, in order to make it more reader-friendly or digestible for your reviewer, it would be helpful to include the context of that. So another thing that we see a lot, it doesn't describe the need for the project. We want to really understand what the hazard problem is, what the risk is, and the implications of not doing that project. You want to tie your project back to the proposed hazard and make sure that those 2 are compatible. It doesn't identify a long-term mitigation solution. And then, we see a lot too, overall summaries. Summaries are great when you're trying to just provide a 30,000-foot view for somebody that you're explaining the project to, for a commissioner meeting or something like that. But here we really want to see all the clearly outlined activities and tasks, and to be as clear, concise, and include all of the relevant details about the project in order to avoid, your reviewer coming back with a lot of questions. We really want to have this buttoned up as close as you can when you first submit. All right, going into a phased project versus a shovel-ready project. Phased projects are interesting in that we don't always know all of the exact details related to the final project design. So your scope of work is going to be organized and should be clearly written into phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 should always include design, environmental, site selection, a refined BCA, and then phase 2, that's when you're actually going to be doing the work. So construction, implementation, and project closeout. You know, this is when the exact details related to the project design are unknown. You may not also know the environmental and historical impacts. If you have less than a 30% design completed at the time of the application submission, you know, this is when you would do that in a phased project. The intended level of protection would be stated as well. And for a phased project, you're still going to be discussing the deliverables to be completed and the associated tasks with those deliverables. And those should be clearly outlined in your scope of work when you're doing a phased project. Your standard projects are going to be those that quote unquote are shovel ready. The exact details of the construction activities, you know, they should be included. You should know your project sites. Environmental historical impacts are known and they're incorporated into the project design. You have a design of at least 30% that is completed, and that there's not a lot of questions left to be answered at this point. The task descriptions, the cost estimates, all should be well defined and supporting with engineering documentation, and then the projects receive approval to proceed with construction. We see a lot of both types of projects, depending on where you are in your stage of the process. It may be best to talk to the state, you know, when you submit your NOI to determine whether the project that you are submitting should be a phased project or whether it would be better submitted as a shovel-ready project. So going into the project budget or the cost estimate, this is when we're going to provide the details of the cost. They should align with the scope of work that we've already completed and documents the required total cost with the federal and local share throughout the course of the project. If you're submitting a phased project, the phased project should be organized into the 2 phases, and it should align with your scope of work. So phase 1 are going to be all those costs associated with design, engineering, environmental, and your final BCA. And then phase 2 being construction or implementation. Our best practices for a project budget, it should include a budget narrative that supports the cost in relationship to the scope of work. So the total cost must be consistent with the federal share plus the matching funds. You also want to make sure that your project estimate is consistent with the project cost in your benefit cost analysis, and that the documentation that supports the cost estimate always has to be included with the sub-application. This can include a detailed engineer's estimate or any standardized construction estimating software such as RS Means. Going to a little bit more, breaking down the project budget a little bit farther. So your cost types must align as closely as possible to the task descriptions in the scope of work. This makes it easier for your reviewer to tie those project costs back to the activities that you've already described. Items in the cost estimate, they should be broken down, you know, into a considerable level for quantity, unit cost, and total cost. FEMA does not appreciate lump sums. We shouldn't be using those to classify costs in the cost estimate. As a general rule of thumb, no item should be more than 10% of the project cost. If you're higher than 10%, you know, you're looking at a total line item budget and a lump sum cost at that time. You also want to round to the nearest dollar in order to align with project estimating software such as NEMIS that the state will be using in order to submit your sub-application. So different types of costs within the estimate that can be include pre-award costs, so the costs associated with developing your sub-application, any contractual costs. This would include any costs that you've used during the course of the project to procure services, construction costs. What are the actual costs of implementing the project? Any permitting costs associated with this. or permitting fees, engineering and design costs, and then we have personnel, site preparation, and then equipment. Specific cost types by project type. So there's going to be obviously different project costs depending on the type of project. So align with those that are most suited to your type of project and go with that. For contingency, this is limited to 5% or 7% for historic properties. And just remember with contingency that sometimes it's better to include those contingency items when you're developing your cost estimates in order to prevent a large overrun. As long as you're able to kind of think about your cost in terms of your best possible resource and FEMA's best possible resource for developing these project costs. Your budget narrative, like we've already kind of described, it should mirror as closely as possible the budget breakdown in the sub-application. What you should include in your budget narrative. Essentially, how did you come up with these costs? We want to include the source or the methodology in each budget item. These can come from previously implemented projects, any quotes, a professional engineer estimate, recognized estimating software, like I said, RS means. A brief description of any projects or deliverables produced by the budget line. So what is the engineer stating that will be produced by this particular line item? How is the quantity calculated? Do you have a methodology for how you develop these costs? If so, is it explainable that you could write it out in a methodology so that we can include these items not only in your cost estimate, but it'll also be referred back to in your benefit cost analysis. And then you also want to include who will be performing the work. Again, is this a contractor, consultant, in-house personnel? If you're including personnel costs, how is the rate calculated? Is it including fringe benefits? Is it by hour using paid salary employees? So all of that can be included in your budget narrative, and it provides a source of backup so that when your reviewer is taking a look at your project, they can clearly define how those project costs were estimated within your sub-application. For the project budget for grant management costs are indirect costs and administrative expenses. They are reasonably incurred by a recipient. They are 100% federal match with no local match required. Something to consider here, the sub-applicant will need to provide backup in order to get reimbursed for these costs. And should be included as a line item in the project budget. Just know that, there is a significant burden on the sub-applicant to ensure that all of these costs are accounted for so that they can be reimbursed, or if there are contractor costs, that those costs can be incurred and reimbursed as well. So tying back into the sub-application, talking about the project schedule. So a best practice for the schedule itself, this is including a Gantt chart. We always recommend this, and FEMA recommends it as a supporting document to visually explain how overlapping or dependent tasks are taking place. So this is especially important when there's multiple facets of the project that are happening at once, and we need to kind of see how those timelines interact with each other and how the project will be implemented. So it should include significant detail to demonstrate that the sub-applicant understands the time necessary to complete the project. It should align with the tasks already described in the scope of work as well as the project budget. It shouldn't introduce new tasks or deliverables in the schedule that you did not discuss in the scope of work. An example of this you know, a lot of projects I've reviewed talk about doing a flood reduction project, and then they reference doing a letter map revision in the schedule, but don't allude to it in the scope of work or the budget. So we want to make sure that these three things really align: your scope of work, your project schedule, and your budget, and that you can tie all these items back to each other. Your project schedule should allow for 2 to 3 months at the end of your schedule for any project and sub-award closeout. This allows the state to work with you to close out this project and ensure all the costs are reimbursed, and to work through any closing items to ensure that you meet federal guidelines. And it must not exceed 36 months for HMGP, but maybe longer for BRIC and FMA project sub-applications, depending on need. So going into your benefit cost analysis, you know, the benefit cost analysis is a pillar in the sub-application development phase. We really do emphasize starting this process earlier on than you would normally think. A lot of sub-applicants complete the sub-application and then they go into their BCA, when, you know, in order to use your time most efficiently, you should really start with a lower bounds analysis, or at least an evaluation of the cost benefit of the project, to ensure that what you're working on is going to be a cost beneficial project in the end, and that your sub application supports that essentially. So, you know, in talking to the state, they do highly recommend, you know, starting with a benefit cost analysis, evaluation, and then moving into your sub application to ensure that you're going after a project and spending your time, money, and resources on a project that is cost beneficial. Hagerty is in with the state now providing support for benefit cost analysis. We do recognize that, you know, the BCA 6.0 is not the easiest type of system to use or to produce a cost beneficial BCA. So we are working with the state to identify projects that may need a little bit of help. So for FEMA HMA funding, the benefit cost analysis must be greater than 1. The sub-applicant must use the FEMA approved methodologies and tools, including the newest version of the toolkit. There are some projects that are eligible for streamlined BCA or pre-calculated benefits. You know, those projects are very specific, and you will have the links for those in here. But the most important critical thing for you to know is that, you know, FEMA does evaluate the BCAs, and they are looking at a very specific system. They are looking at that your cost benefit analysis was done correctly. So you really do want to spend time in getting this right. You know, a BCA narrative is the best practice. It's a report or a memo that just describes the BCA methodology and supporting documentation. This is critical for complex projects, for any flood risk reduction and infrastructure retrofit projects. So keep that in mind. Also included within all sub-applications are environmental and historic preservation. So there, for HMGP specifically, there is the DHSEM eligibility and EHP checklist. If you don't have a copy of that, one of the state folks can get that over to you. And it basically just outlines and supports that environmental and historic preservation have been considered through this project. Things that make the process a little bit easier when you're having an EHP review, you want to include supporting documentation that clearly outlines the project work area, any staging areas. So this is going to include your floodplain maps, your wetland maps, critical habitat maps, just to ensure that FEMA understands exactly where these projects are taking place. EHP considerations and acknowledgement should be incorporated, again, into the project scope of work, schedule, and your budget. So these are some resources that we wanted to point you to, and on the deck that will be sent out, you'll be able to click on these for the links. but some of these are just U.S. Fish and Wildlife, flood mapping, historic preservation, and then EHP checklist, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and then the CDC SBI will give you information on the social vulnerability index for your area. So other supporting documentation that's critical in submitting these sub-applications required for all projects include the match commitment letter signed by the authorized agent. You know, this is going to verify that you know exactly what your match is and how you'll be able to pay that in accordance, you know, with these grants and their different match requirements. There's a maintenance commitment letter that should be signed by the authorized agent. A maintenance commitment letter essentially lines out who's responsible for the asset, who will be doing maintenance on it for the life of the project. Administrative documents, these are your SF 424s, essentially the FEMA budget and narrative worksheets that outlines all of the assurances and everything that your community will need to undertake as they accept the awards for the particular project grants. And then the EHP checklist we've alluded to before outlines the EHP considerations that are needed when you're submitting your sub-application. Other supporting documentation, anything that would support your benefit cost analysis. This includes your project design, engineering designs, any feasibility studies for best management practices. This includes, you know, your photos, your maps, any site or project specific documents. If you're working or doing a sub-application related to actual, let's say, homeowner structures such as acquisitions, you know, those are going to require certain pieces of documentation that are included with your sub-application that a flood project wouldn't. So make sure that, you know, you do have access to those and you know what documentation you'll need to complete at all stages of sub-application development. Lastly, project coordinates, longitude and latitude. This is especially helpful for FEMA when they're reviewing their EHP considerations, and including these on your maps and your photos will definitely help the reviewer in visualizing your project. Here we have an example of a map that was submitted for vegetation management under wildfire. The only thing that I would add here is we could even add some coordinates to give the reviewer a better indication of where these areas are in the Denver metro area. And then examples of photos. And typically, you know, we want to see photos that are clear. They should be color. Typically, we look at project photos that are at least 4 inches by 6 inches in size. They should be clear, labeled, and they pertain to the project activity areas. It's also helpful if you include a directional coordinate, you know, north, south, east, west, along with any specific identifying address or location. All right. So for BRIC and FMA, we do have a little bit more of a specific requirement that FEMA does consider when they're looking at these two projects. You know, like Mark said, we are prioritizing HMGP for this presentation, but I did want to briefly go over some items, at least for BRIC here. You know, technical points for BRIC are allocated in an all or nothing approach. FEMA has decided, you know, if you meet this criteria, you get the points. If you don't have the criteria, you get no points. A couple of these items, you know, is it impacting an infrastructure project? So these are going to be your large scale infrastructure projects. Are they looking at, you know, large types of wastewater treatment plants, larger facilities that provide critical services to the community? Do they incorporate nature-based solutions? So these are the items that go beyond the typical gray infrastructure and add nature-based solutions or a more nature-based outlook for this project. You know, a couple examples of this, excuse me, would be willow plantings, or, you know, rebuilding of a wetland for a flood project, or using goats, yes, goats that we've seen for vegetation management and wildfire. If your sub-applicant or if you as the community have a building code effectiveness grading schedule of 1 to 5, this takes into account the building codes that are being implemented in your jurisdiction. If you need to check to see whether you have these, you can certainly check with your building official. They would have this information. We see that almost no projects are submitted or funded without BSEGs, very few. Is the application generated from a previous HMA Advanced Assistance Award? Did they do a previous AA project for the design of this, or a feasibility study, and now they're doing the project? They want to see that you're overmatching at least 30% for sub-applicants. So they want to see that sub-applicants are expanding their footprint and, you know, putting some additional funds into the project. And then they're taking into account the CDC SBI of the area. So they're looking at disadvantaged communities to see whether these projects impact these areas. Other items that they take into consideration, how effectively does the project reduce the risk? And these are more a little bit, you don't get all or nothing, you get graded. So there's up to a certain number of points. So it basically is a gradient scale for qualitative evaluation. It looks at risk reduction, whether the sub-application takes into account or the project takes into account climate change and future conditions. So are we only mitigating to the 50-year event, or are we looking to the 100 or 500-year event? Implementation measures. They want to see that the sub-application includes all of the measures needed, and that the sub-applicant ensures all of the steps that are involved in order to complete the project. They want to look at your population. Are you promoting and serving a disadvantaged, overburdened community? Community engagement and other outreach. Is this project supported by the community? Are there other impacts that are going to be implemented through this project? And has the community really reached out to kind of gauge community involvement? And then leveraging partners. Do they have other entities kind of helping out with this project? Are there going to be other financial partners that would help with the local match? Important considerations overall for BRIC, you know, we're looking at disadvantaged, overburdened, underserved communities, adaptive, nature-based solutions, and any ancillary benefits that address, you know, inequities and carbon emissions, even looking at labor. You can go back to the NOFA for a little bit more on that for that project. Turning over for FMA special requirements. The biggest thing here is that sub-applicants must be participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. They shouldn't be withdrawn on probation or suspended. The structures identified in the sub-application should have active NFIP policies in effect prior to the opening of the application period. And FMA is really going to prioritize projects that have the greatest benefit to the NFIP, and particularly through flood risk reduction to repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss properties. And throughout all of the project types under FMA, capacity, CNCB, individual flood, and localized flood risk reduction, they really want to see that you're impacting NFIP structures. For the localized flood risk reduction projects, there is a requirement that a file be included for a map of the project footprint so that it shows the project benefiting area, and that an H&H study should be included. New this year, FEMA will be providing assistance to EDRCs for BRIC, federally recognized tribal governments, and communities with a CDC SVI greater than 0.8, in developing BCAs in situations when the communities are unable to calculate a BCR. The project still must be eligible and competitive. So, you know, both of the NOFOs outline this. There's not a ton of guidance as to how this assistance will be given, but note that if you do fall within this criteria and you are having this issue, you know, reach out to the state to talk about this and to see if there's anything that the state can do for you in order to accomplish a VCR. So for all the requirements outlined in these programs, please make sure to read the BRIC NOFOs here. There's links to those, and then reach out to the state with any of your questions. So talking about next steps for BRIC and FMA, we want to make sure overall that you have access to FEMA Go if you intend on submitting a sub-application. You want to obtain your UEI and SAM information. These are those numbers that are associated with each individual community. Attend any FEMA BRIC or FMA webinars. Of course, read over the NOFOs. Obtain your BSEGS rating if you're going after BRIC. The projects that we've seen go forward always have a good BSEGS rating. And then discuss partnerships for your local match. Who else would benefit from the community that would want to be involved? Some things for HMGP specifically, or for all programs really. If you have a project idea, go ahead and submit an NOI to the state. You know, you can register for EM grants. Go ahead and start looking at what a scope, schedule, and budget look like if you haven't already. Go ahead and, you know, gather those data points and documentation that's needed for the BCA, and reach out to the state to see, you know, what program best fits your project. So that was a lot of information. Is there any questions that we want to address, Mark, right now that you're seeing a lot of in the chat, or any things you want to specifically go over?
Nothing really comes to mind, Lauren. I think mostly, I think the questions in the chat have been answered as we go, or as we have gone.
Okay. All right. Anybody have any questions that you want to address now? I think we have just, what, about 5 minutes, Mark?
Yeah.
Hey, Mark, can I clarify my bundling question?
Sure.
I was just wondering, I think there's a variety of potential applicants on here with, you know, different scales and capacities to implement projects at the scale of what usually gets funded through FEMA. And so I'm just wondering if there's any effort at this state level to, at the notice of interest phase, to kind of help people work together maybe towards a joint application versus a bunch of smaller independent applications that are less likely to be successful.
So there has not been, you know, and I think part of that is just due to the paradigm shift from the pre-disaster mitigation program, which was really designed for smaller localized projects, you know, to the scale. And when we talk about wildfire in particular, the two BRIC projects that were competitively selected in California, the first one was a $50 million project. The second was a $40 million project, and Hagerty helped write both of those. And, you know, you're talking thousands of homes, thousands of acres, I believe all pretty contiguous. So to some degree, I'm also not sure how much bundling pockets across the state would accomplish what you're asking. I think on a regional level, certainly. You know, you think about the, you know, if the West, as an example, if the Western Regional Wildfire Council was to put a bundled project together in all 6 or even 5 of their counties, you know, I think that might approach what you're talking about. Matt, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, and we usually encourage this at the local level. So for instance, the town of Superior had a wildfire project they want to do. Boulder County has a wildfire project they want to do. We've encouraged them to talk together to see if they could, I guess, bundle their applications in their scope of works and then just have one sub application that encompasses both areas. So we do certainly encourage it on the local level, but we don't have anything in place statewide at the state.
It may be worth, when you're in discussions with State Forest Service, I know that's something that they've had a lot of success doing with their WUI grants that are passed through USDA Forest Service, where they kind of like pre-bundle at the regional level towards those federal awards, knowing that this is kind of our target grant size. I don't know if that's, it's comparing apples to oranges for sure, but just a consideration with this new program with BRIC.
Yeah, I appreciate the comment. In the conversation, the challenge has sometimes been people make the leap to, okay, now the state can write the application for us, which we can't, because there's nothing we know about your community that you don't, but there is tons that you know about your community that we don't. But again, appreciate the conversation.
That's interesting. Awesome.
Other questions? Matt Haldeman, so your question about an intergovernmental agreement, multiple municipalities, certainly. And from our perspective, that agreement really needs to be something that the two communities feel comfortable with. We're not going to require that you have, because there's only one sub applicant, and that's who we're dealing with, and that's who FEMA awards it to.
Like I'm in Uray, the city of Uray. It's a small community. Like, for example, if we have an intergovernmental agreement with Uray County, or we apply as a whole entity, like together on a flood hazard mitigation grant.
Right. So for us, it would in that case, it would either be the city or the county that was applying, and the other would be their partner. The format for that partnership really doesn't matter to us. Like when the city participated in the county's hazard mitigation plan update, which was grant funded by FEMA, it was a letter from the city signed probably by the mayor that said, yes, we're going to participate and do all these things, and we're going to contribute to the match.
Gotcha.
It could be a full IGA, could be, a legally binding contract. That we're not going to dictate that.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
And we have seen, I'll just kind of pop in, we have seen MOUs or memorandums of understanding used for that particular function.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. We've got about a minute left. Any other questions out there that we didn't get to? All right. Well, hearing none, again, we thank you for joining us today. This webinar and the slides will be posted to our website. We do look forward to working with you in the future, because we want the same thing you want, to help reduce your risk on the ground in your community, to maybe prevent the next disaster. So again, we hope to hear from you, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.